Hello, and you are listening to Eco Justice Radio on KPFK Los Angeles and KPFT Houston. A project of SoCal 350 Climate Action, our show presents environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame, featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Eco Justice Radio acknowledges that we record the show on the traditional territory of the Tongva and all of their relatives. Welcome, I am Jessica Aldridge. On today's show, Room to Roam, the importance of wildlife connectivity and crossings, I will be interviewing Beth Pratt, California Regional Executive Director of National Wildlife Federation. Beth Pratt has worked in environmental leadership roles for more than 25 years and in two of the biggest national parks, Yosemite and Yellowstone. As the California Regional Executive Director for the National Wildlife Federation, she leads the Save LA Cougars campaign to build the largest wildlife crossing in North America and potentially the world to help save a population of mountain lions from extinction. Her work has been featured in The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, BBC World Service, CBS This Morning, and the Los Angeles Times and NPR. She is the author of 3 books. The most recent, Yosemite Wildlife, will be released in 2023. The proliferation of suburban sprawl built without consideration of where wildlife live and thrive increasingly threatens the safety and genetic diversity of wild animals and plant species. Migrating wildlife of all shapes and sizes must contend with humans driving on the 4.8 million miles of roads in the United States, facing the danger of colliding with vehicles. Aside from driving less, one strategy to mitigate these accidents has gained bipartisan acceptance, providing wildlife crossings that facilitate connectivity for a diverse group of species from animals to plants. Stay tuned as we explain the meaning of connectivity, how wildlife crossings work, and the unique engineering giving geographic features or species involved. Not all wildlife crossings are simple bridges or tunnels. Most are much more complex. In fact, our guest today has been championing for years what will become the world's largest urban wildlife crossing planned for suburban Los Angeles. Today, we discuss the importance of connectivity and wildlife crossings and why they are a magic bullet for conservation efforts, and why preserving biodiversity not only protects wildlife, but also human species. Thank you for tuning in to Eco Justice Radio and our show, Room to Roam, the importance of wildlife connectivity and crossings. I am your host, Jessica Aldridge, and it is my honor to welcome our guest, Beth Pratt, California Regional Executive Director of National Wildlife Federation. Welcome to Eco Justice Radio.
Welcome, Beth.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm coming to you from where I live outside Yosemite National Park, and want to acknowledge I'm on the lands of the Southern Sierra Miwok. So coming to you from 2 very different places.
Yes, we are. And thank you for that. Beth, today's show is about wildlife connectivity and crossings. First, let's define what is meant by these 2 things and what they look like.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think they're used interchangeably and they're not. Connectivity is the broader issue, right? Wildlife needs connectivity to have a future, to thrive. Crossings is a very specific solution to the connectivity problem, but there are many. And when you hear crossing, it's usually referring to one of those sort of overpasses over a freeway, with an arc and stuff, but they can come in many shapes, sizes, forms, and for many different species. But I like to use the broader term connectivity to talk about, again, the issue of what we need to address for wildlife. And then again, crossings would be one solution to.
When we think about wildlife crossings, we may think about the mountain lions or wolves. However, there are so many animals that benefit from the wildlife crossings. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, this is what, I think for most people, we think megafauna, right? How do you get the charismatic megafauna across the road? And those are the types of crossing most people are familiar with seeing either in Banff or other areas with the fun photos of moose and grizzly bears walking across. But crossings themselves, these structures have been built for all size, animals. One of my favorite is up here in the Sierra. It was built for the Yosemite toad on a road that they were getting mushed a lot by cars. And this is actually a ramp that actually goes on the road and the toads go under it. But crossings can also come in sort of even weirder forms, like there are water cannons that actually shoot salmon over dams or other obstacles to help them in their journey, of course, upstream. So it just, they're all over. There's crab crossings, turtle crossings, you name it. So it's a solution that's used for a wide variety of animal life.
And what about plants? That's another form of wildlife. Are the crossings beneficial to plants as well?
Yeah, this was eye-opening to me. So when I first started working on the Liberty Canyon crossing, which I know we'll talk about in depth, but I knew enough about wildlife crossings to get me in trouble, much like you had asked. I knew about the big megafauna ones where, elk and deer went across, but, really diving into what it takes to preserve biodiversity in the context of connectivity, it was fascinating to me that the little animals, the little guys, as I call them, lizards, birds needed it, but also plants. So, to be resilient, whether it be plants or animals, you need genetic diversity. I think we all know inbreeding's bad. It's icky. It comes with a lot of health problems if it continues. Well, that's no different for wildlife, and it's no different for plants. Plants need connectivity for seed dispersal, for genetic exchange. And if you're plopping down a 10-lane freeway in the middle of an ecosystem, you're just not facilitating any exchange. You can get some dust across the freeway, but that's about it.
Well, I think this leads into my next question pretty well about this concept of biodiversity and, how connectivity of habitats is so crucial to sustaining biodiversity, to growing biodiversity, especially in the face of climate change issues, correct?
Yeah. And again, this is what I love about science is it changes when we know more. And I think when I was coming up 30 years ago now, over 30 years ago, and getting my degree in the biology field and starting to work in conservation, the definitive paradigm back then was you put aside a Yosemite, you put aside a wildlife refuge, and you have these islands of protected open space, and that's where the wildlife goes. And you put the people in other areas and check the box. We've saved wildlife, but wasn't right. And we now know from science that what is key to preserving not just wildlife, but ecosystems for, again, the flora and the fauna is connectivity for resiliency. And that means actually opening up our human spaces to connect these wild spaces. So it's not like you need a Yosemite on every block, but you do need to facilitate movement for plants and animals across green spaces that do come into what we think of as, or at least used to think of as off limits for the natural world, like a place like Los Angeles. Connectivity and healthy ecosystems and healthy habitats, they need this for resiliency. I was just on a talk the other night, and a friend of mine used a quote I often use too from a very non-environmental movie, World War Z with Brad Pitt. One of my favorite zombie movies because the zombies are fast. Like the zombies in The Walking Dead don't scare me. They're slow. You can usually get away from them. But fast zombies are terrifying. But Brad Pitt has a great line that I've used as well, which movement is life. And it's true. For humans, for the natural world, you do need movement. And let me give you a great example of this in California. Fire. Okay, fire is a great example. Now, fire is a something that anything that lives in California has some adaptations to. Fire is part of the natural cycle. What's not part of the natural cycle, and I refuse to call them wildfires. These are not what's happening now are not wildfires. They are human-caused firestorms. And nothing can really adapt to that, mainly because you can't move. If you watch a lightning burn in Yosemite, and I've actually walked near some, and you see a squirrel on one side and, the lightning burning, the fire burning on another, or even, lightning does cause fast moving fires too, but animals have options, right? So if it burns in one place where there's no food and habitat, they're able to move, escape it, and use the food and shelter in another place. Well, look at what happened with the Woolsey fire and even more fires in the Santa Monica Mountains. 50% of the open space burned. You had even mountain lions who are adapted to, they have a great adaptation to fire. You're usually fast enough to be able to get out of the way. We had one lion in the National Park Service study, P64, who survived the fire, but likely, based on his GPS points, what we think happened is he couldn't get out of the fire zone after the fire ended because of the roads. And so he actually ended up dying, we think, of starvation and had burnt paws. So there's a great example of how the resiliency is lost because of the lack of connectivity. And then for the rest of the mountain lions, 50% of the usable open space was burnt. They don't have options to go to the next neighborhood because there's people there or there's a freeway there. So that's how it plays out in very different ways up the food chain. And then again, you can give the same examples going down to lizards and birds.
And you're talking about some examples of urban environments with the freeways and the roads. What other particular obstacles do urban environments present to wildlife connectivity?
So many. I mean, it's fascinating to me when you start thinking about connectivity. Roads, of course, a 10-lane freeway is an obvious barrier, but it's eye-opening to contemplate what are other barriers to wildlife movement and survival. Putting on too many lights in your house can disrupt bird migrations. If you have fences that don't allow wildlife to move, that block good wildlife movement through your neighborhood, that's an impediment. Human presence is an impediment in itself. What I ask people to do, and this was a journey for me too, we really need to look at the landscape and our use of it in a different way. Even things we took for granted before or we thought weren't environmentally impactful. And I'll give you a great example of this. Trails. I use trails. I love to hike. I love, I'm mainly a hiker, but I like to mountain bike. Nobody, and I wouldn't have thought even 10 years ago, if you plop down a trail in the middle of a big open space area, if that could be impactful. But it can be very impactful to the entire ecosystem if you site it in a bad place that has repercussions. We know now from a lot of study that just the trail itself, if the wildlife, it's not even just the immediate trail they will avoid if people are on it, but then you start radiating out that they avoid areas beyond just because of a human presence in some areas. But if you're putting it in ecologically sensitive areas, and there's one trail up near me that there's a sensitive newt population, there's sensitive butterfly populations, you can look at, just like the localized extinction possibility of the mountain lions, you can look at localized extensions of newts or, all the smaller stuff is too. So, citing trails, limiting use. I think this era of just driving and recreation without boundaries, we need to rethink, not just cars, although I think we really do have to reckon with the moral cost of driving on both people and wildlife in a way we haven't before, but also just our day-to-day activity. It's not that we stop doing things, but I think thinking about, again, do you have a light on your deck that you keep on at all nights that's impeding bird movement? Can you change that out? Are there trails maybe we close to recreation to allow for migrations or travel during sensitive times? It's a whole new rethinking of conservation.
Well, one of the things that you had mentioned to me prior to this interview that I didn't even think of, but this concept of fences. And in our urban environments where our fences butt up against each other and create no way for the animals to move except for being in the middle of the streets.
Yeah. LA is doing some pretty progressive stuff as usual. I think, California, it's not perfect, but really on the progressive side of making way for native wildlife. And LA is leading, in my mind, California. The city of LA is doing a wildlife pilot study where they're actually looking at how could we in the future incorporate into building codes and permitting for development to take wildlife into consideration, which would be, don't put, if you have lots, you can't put the fence right against each other because that doesn't give the wildlife passage. They just end up in the roads. I've retraced P22's likely route from the central Santa Monica Mountains to Griffith Park about a dozen times. I don't know how that cat made it across 2 freeways or any of the neighborhoods. It's really interesting, the obstacles that urban wildlife face every day. Like, and here's a dog chasing you. Here's another area where there's fences. Here's light pollution. Dr. Travis Longcore, he has done some really groundbreaking work on how light pollution impedes connectivity. Indeed, he's mapped out how P22's likely route from the central Santa Monica Mountains right into Griffith Park was probably dictated by avoiding lights. Right. For me, I ask people, start putting on your animals' eyes because it is eye-opening the obstacles they face, especially in our urban environments, but also in our rural. I live really rurally, and I'm still really sensitive to what I'm doing on my property, how it might impede animal movement, again, large and small, whether it be butterflies or my local mountain lion that lives in the backyard.
What about the health of people? So how does wildlife crossings and connectivity have an effect on the health of people?
Yeah. First of all, I think I do some work in Watts, and that has just been such an incredible experience to be part of that community and hear their perspective and try to, incorporate the environmental justice angle of this. And I'd say that folks in communities like Watts know everything about how systems like highways and freeways disconnect health of communities.
And I just want one moment though, because our listeners are from all over the United States and globally. If you can just say where Watts is, because, we also air in Houston, but then we're also a global broadcast as well.
Yeah. So Watts is, when you think about where the wildlife crossing is going and where, P22 lives in Griffith Park and then the Santa Monica Mountains, where the wildlife crossing is going, there's a lot of open space there. But you talk about Watts and, sort of that South Central LA, they are in the middle of freeway nightmareness, right? I mean, the freeway system, just look on a map in LA, is on a scale that I don't think anywhere in the United States. I've lived in Boston, New York. They can fit in a little corner of LA. And as we know, these freeways have enormous impacts on disconnecting communities, on then health, right? Pollution, you name it, anything. And so, the connecting sort of the wildlife's plight, this hip hop artist I work with, Warren Dixon, we actually did a video called If I Was Wild. You can go to ifiwaswild.org, where he told the story of how he connected the wildlife. They're the same systematic oppression of these roadways and a lack of connectivity is what he feels like is comparable to what he and his community experience because of these freeways and other obstacles being plopped down in the middle of communities, and how it's disrupted both socially and psychologically, but also, to your point, health-wise, right? Physically, from the pollution and other things. So just the specific roadways that we're trying to address themselves have health issues. But then you get into the larger issue that if we don't preserve biodiversity and promote healthy ecosystems by promoting connectivity, what are we in right now? A pandemic? Case in point, one of the reasons we are having a pandemic is because of a lack of connected and healthy, robust ecosystems. And so And this is not the last one we're going to have. It's not going to be the last effect. And then you get into the impacts of things like climate change, fires in Colorado in December and January. We just had a fire in Big Sur that's burning at this time of year. So, connectivity also, again, promotes resiliency in the context of impacts like climate change. And so, if I can't convince you to just love the animals and want to help them get across the road or help mountain lions have a future, I'm sure you want to have a future for yourself. And then if we lose wildlife species as well, because we don't have connectivity, look at human health impacts. An interesting connection, East Coast, where I grew up, the eastern panther, which is a mountain lion, went extinct. You have an overpopulation of deer there. And some scientists kind of half jokingly are saying, bring back the mountain lion, because what do you also have there? Lyme disease. Not that we don't have it in California, but much greater incidences back there. So healthy ecosystems, healthy wildlife, directly connected to our own health.
Directly connected. Well, we're going to take a break real quick and come back to this conversation. We're going to start talking about where these crossings and connectivity projects exist and start getting into, what we can do about all of this and how we can support it. So stay with us and we'll be right back.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. We air every Monday at 9 a.m. on KPFT Houston and our new time Wednesday at 3 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles. Stay connected by subscribing to Eco Justice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today, you are listening to Room to Roam, the importance of wildlife connectivity and crossings, with host Jessica Aldridge and guest Beth Pratt, California Regional Executive Director of National Wildlife Federation.
Beth, we've been talking about the importance of wildlife crossings and connectivity, and I want to talk about some examples. When and where was the first wildlife crossing created, and where around the world do we find projects to support connectivity and crossings?
So wildlife crossings have a fascinating history, and that I've been learning. And Ben Goldfarb is writing a book on wildlife crossings that I can't wait for, because they're all over the globe, and they're all for different species and different reasons, and it's amazing. But the first wildlife crossing that we know of went in France in the 50s. And the first wildlife crossing in the U.S. went into, of all places, Florida, not known for being the greenest state, to help with bears who were getting killed on some of their freeways. On this continent, though, I think most people's introduction to wildlife crossings are the ones in Banff. If you go up to Banff National Park, those are sort of the gold standard. They were put in over 20 years ago now. And boy, they've had over, I think, almost 300,000 successful, at least large mammals use them. They're extremely successful. They were put in because you have these really busy roads going through the Banff National Park that a lot of animals were getting hit. Where you see them in the United States, and we are a little behind the rest of the world, you see more crossings overseas, but we're catching up in the U.S. And where they are primarily now, interestingly enough, are the Rockies and Western states, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Nevada. And what they're really addressing is, again, a roadkill problem, because you have vast ungulate migrations in these states, elk, deer, bighorn, pronghorn, and they get killed. I'll tell you, I lived in Yellowstone for 4 years. And if you were in the morning going to Bozeman Airport from the park, you went up the night before, because here in California, we get a couple deer at a time. There, it's 1,000 elk trying to get across the road, or bison, or you name it. And roadkill is a huge issue there. It's not that it's not an issue here, but it's on a scale that I think in California, we can't comprehend, because we don't have 1,000 deer crossing a road anywhere in one place. So there are, in a lot of those states, I think that some people have seen them. And there's other crossings, like in Texas, there's one for ocelots that's an underpass. Florida has, of course, a whole series of underpasses and fencing for the Florida panther. There's, as I mentioned, a Yosemite toad crossing up here. California now is a little behind the rest of the U.S. Of course, we're about to jump in the lead with Liberty Canyon, but we do have them here. We have underpasses and other. There's one smaller overpass down in Southern California, a little south of LA. So they're around the U.S. There's no comprehensive map, which I keep pushing for someone to put together, but you can find them in a lot of the Western states right now.
And we're going to get into later in the conversation into detail on some of these where you can describe, I'll have you describe, how these are working and where they are in the country, especially the ones in Texas. The way a wildlife crossing works in one environment may differ in another area of country. What elements are necessary to make up an ideal and an effective wildlife crossing and transportation corridor?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think people look at one crossing and then say, well, why can't the other, why can't your crossing look like this? We get that a lot with Liberty. Like, well, why do you have to build such a big crossing? Well, one of the differences is that, we have a 10-lane freeway, one of the largest freeways in the world to deal with. But, every crossing is site specific. So it's based on what the geography is in the area. What are you trying to do, right? Some crossings are trying to just solve a roadkill problem. Others, like our crossing at Liberty Canyon, we get very little roadkill because it's such a barrier. They're not even trying to cross. So roadkill can be a really good indication of where you need crossings, but also no roadkill avoidance can be an alarm bell too, because again, then you get into that genetic isolation. So you want to look at what species or what is your project goal? What's the geography in the area? And those will start dictating what type of crossing you need to build, where you need to build it. So for instance, underpasses that are well lighted and, aren't sort of dark tunnels, deer will use, for example. But if you put in a tunnel with not a lot of sighting, you will write off a lot of wildlife at that point. So, it really depends on, what wildlife you want to save. And again, some places you can put an underpass in pretty easily. Liberty Canyon's another great example. We looked at putting something under the freeway. 10 lanes and an access road, you can't even drill that. You'd have to cut open the freeway and put in a tunnel. And then that's not like you see some of these underpasses. It's basically just, you can see the whole landscape. It's not a tunnel. It's just more, and the road has lifted up off the freeway. A tunnel eliminates a lot of species, and you don't get plants. You don't get, that connectivity for plants. A lot of animals don't like dark spaces. There's actually a culvert at Liberty Canyon, which Jeff Sikich, the lead biologist for the National Park Service, has actually walked all the way through. I'm way too claustrophobic. They've had cameras on it. They did have one mountain lion in the 20-year study use it in multiple times, but he's the only one. And as far as other wildlife, almost nothing. I think they might have had like a possum or something because, especially animals that are prey aren't going to use dark spaces where they don't have sight lines.
Exactly.
But overpasses. I was just going to say overpasses, especially if it's designed with habitat and cover, you're pretty much a great all-purpose solution for the most variety of wildlife.
How do you define success then? Like, what is the success rate of these type of projects? I mean, they work. But then how do you define that?
How do you define that? Yeah. Well, first of all, the other, I neglected to mention the number one thing you need for any wildlife crossing, and that is protected space on both sides of it, right? So if you are just dropping animals down into the target parking lot, obviously that's not, you can't build a crossing in a site like that. So you really need where you site these to have protected space on both sides of whatever crossing. But so success, again, this can be really different parameters. I think for a lot of these crossings, and rightly so, the success rate is, and this is what you're seeing in many of these like Banff and in other places, 80 to 90% reduction in collisions with wildlife. I mean, that's a huge success rate. So that's one measure of success. For Liberty Canyon, our measure of success is going to be not, again, there's not a lot of roadkill there to begin with. There's some, but it's going to be the genetic diversity goes up for not just mountain lions, but again, they're seeing some of the decline in lizards and birds. So that's another measure of success for these crossings. So, I mean, again, it sort of depends on the problem you're trying to solve is one measure of it.
Another estimate, is there an idea of the ideal number of wildlife crossings and connectivity projects that need to exist throughout the United States? And on top of that, are we able to fix and retrofit our current infrastructure to meet that need? Or are we looking at tearing out freeways and rebuilding things across the board?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And I think wildlife crossings are incredible solutions. In some areas, they really are like the magic bullet, right? I mean, there's a lot of environmental problems. There's no magic bullet, but a lot of these places, you put them up and the wildlife, they work. But yeah, I think the issue of connectivity is not going to be solved just by wildlife crossings. I think that it is a big part of the solution, but we have to look at repurposing roads, like in urban areas where there's no green space to connect to. Of course, what did I tell you? The number one, thing you need for wildlife crossing is protected space and green space to connect. But if you're looking at a middle of New York City where there's no green space to connect to, that's a problem. So I think that, the ideal vision is also accompany this with, and I want this for LA too. Let's just take out some of these thoroughfares and green it up, right? Driving less. We have to get out of our cars for many reasons, for climate reasons. But again, that moral cost of driving. Fraser Schilling with the UC Ecology Center, did some really groundbreaking statistical studies around the pandemic and just how much wildlife was saved, the decrease in wildlife getting hit by cars, and then the savings, right? The healthcare, because you have accidents with wildlife. It's not just the wildlife that get hurt, it's the people, right? So it shows you that if we're staying off the roads, the wildlife are behave differently. And then look at something like Yosemite National Park during the pandemic, right? There's one of the best protected places on the planet, right? It's, but yet the pandemic, when Yosemite was closed to all people for that first few months, the wildlife even started behaving differently there in response. So I think the problem's going to be, to fix it is going to take, wildlife crossings are an essential part of that, but it's going to take a rethinking of our environment. I don't think you can retrofit everywhere. And I think that we are going to have to bring back green space, not just for wildlife, but for people. I mean, for me, again, working in a place like Watts, which, they need green space, right? They need spaces there that to help with things like heat island effect and all that. And that means, you're not going to sort of retrofit your way out of that. You're really going to have to rethink some of these urban infrastructures and bring green back for the health of wildlife and people. And that means transportation is going to have to change. That means, we're going to have to get out of our cars and repurpose. Like, to me, it's tearing up some of these roads and, not paving paradise, as Joni Mitchell.
Very true. You had mentioned this idea of the magic bullet when it comes to wildlife crossings and connectivity projects. Is there support at the political level to develop these projects? I know that there's a federal and state budget that's been applied here. And I think that you've even said to me that it's sort of a bipartisan support that exists for this. So if you want to expand upon that.
Yeah, one of the things I love, and, if you look at how Liberty Canyon's played out too, it's, there's very little opposition to these in most cases. There's a few, but I think they were unique cases. But we enjoy widespread support on both sides of the aisle. And my own organization, the National Wildlife Federation, we're, very much we work with both sides, bring sides together, very much, bipartisan. We were making progress even under the Trump administration and working on wildlife crossing fundings. I think that most of us, not all, love wildlife and don't want them to, to be hit by cars. I mean, that's a lot of suffering. And I think roadkill makes most people sad. So yeah, you do see these wildlife crossings get a lot of support. I think also because, again, they are a solution we can see. A lot of environmental issues we work on, like climate change, we both work on climate change. It's hard sometimes, right? There isn't like sometimes a tangible solution. Wildlife crossings, you build it, that which comes with jobs and a boost to the economy, and it works. You get to watch the fun videos of the animals going across. So there just is widespread support for this, which is now translating because, politicians see that these projects are popular as well with their constituencies. This is translating now into dollars from the government, so that I hope it's something like, I hope to be out of a job at some point, at least in terms of having to fundraise privately for these crossings, that I think in the future, they're just going to be embedded in transportation budgets.
And they are currently, right?
Yeah, and that's where the good news is. You now see the transportation federally, the Biden administration, they passed an infrastructure bill that includes $350 million for wildlife crossings. My own organization was at the national level a part of that and a part of trying to make that happen. And then you look at the state of California, Governor Newsom, who's a big supporter of Liberty Canyon. I was honored to be able to give him a personal tour of it. He has a legacy. His dad, was instrumental in protecting mountain lions in the state. So for him, this is really sort of a legacy of his father to now, keep these mountain lions on the landscape. But he wants to be, make sure California, especially as part of the 30/30 initiative, right, is a leader in crossings, along with Secretary Crowfoot. They're both very supportive of crossings. Indeed, to the tune of the last budget was, I think it was 61 or 63 million was in there for connectivity and crossings. So now you're seeing a lot of government support for these projects, which to me are just win-win-win, right? They work, they eliminate roadkill, they provide jobs. They're going to help with connectivity and biodiversity, which we know is good for the health of people. And, one thing we haven't talked about, which I think is just as important, is the psychological effect of connecting people to wildlife, which I've come to see as a right. And I think that especially in these urban landscapes, we do a disservice and environmental groups, even like my own for a long time, are like, oh yeah, wildlife, you got to go to Yosemite to connect to that. But I think, P22 and putting a crossing down in the middle of the most highly urbanized place in the country allows kids and adults to connect to wildlife right there in their backyard. And I see this, I do a lot of school talks and, I talked this one class at the first P22 day moved me to tears. And again, as sort of a white privileged person, it really woke me up to when I was growing up and I was having a bad day, in second grade and a boy didn't like me or I got a bad grade. I had nature, right? I lived in the suburbs, but I had woods and nature and parks and wildlife to see. And that helped me psychologically to deal with issues. One school I work with right in the middle of the city, like almost zero access to urban space. It is 100% kids of color and about 30% undocumented. And they have challenges I can't even, that are just so on a monumental scale. Like they go home and not knowing if their parents were going to be deported, right? And so they have that right to have nature as a psychological safety net as well. And one boy at the first P22 festival from this class read a letter saying, and it was a longer letter to P22, he read it on stage. And during it, he said, P22, I'm sorry you're scared and sad and lonely. I know how you feel. That's a second grader. And, it woke me up to also the importance of this psychological connection to wildlife that we deny people when we say that wildlife doesn't belong in a city. So I think that, P22 and this wildlife crossing and putting more crossings and putting more connectivity projects in urban spaces, it's not just the ecological and, biodiversity effects. It's the psychological safety that we all get from it that I think, for me, is a right for everybody.
Thank you, Beth. We're going to go to break real quick and come back and talk about the different projects that you've been mentioning, like Liberty Canyon, some of the ones in Texas, Montana, Parleys Canyon in Utah. and then also talk about some other efforts that people can take interest in. And we'll be right back. Stay with us.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. We air every Monday at 9 a.m. on KPFT Houston and our new time Wednesday at 3 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles. Stay connected by subscribing to Eco Justice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today, you are listening to Room to Roam, the importance of wildlife connectivity and crossings, with host Jessica Aldridge and guest Beth Pratt, California Regional Executive Director of National Wildlife Federation.
Beth, we've been talking about wildlife crossings and connectivity, how there's bipartisan support, what these projects mean. One question that I was wanting to ask before we start getting into some of the details of the projects that exist is if a wildlife crossing is not built in a certain area, would this play a role in that animal's extinction or the destruction of that ecosystem?
Yeah, I'd say that one, it depends, right? So if you look at crossings in areas that there's open space everywhere, right? So some of these crossings in the Rockies or remote areas, I'd say that they are more solving for roadkill issues. And if you didn't put them in, would the animals go extinct? It would probably depend. Probably not in a lot of areas. And, although if you have more and more development, more and more roads, the pressure could definitely be there. But for a lot of these areas, it's just that it's a roadkill issue. These animals are being slaughtered, but not everywhere. Yeah. Like the project I work on, if you don't put a crossing in because, there's not a lot of open space options, you are looking at localized extinction. And one thing I will say, though, even to, areas where it may not impact right away, we shouldn't wait till animals become threatened with extinction. Keep the common wildlife common, right? Because as we know, one population goes, that impacts the next population and the next population. I always like to use the monarch butterfly, right? I mean, we used to have millions just a few years ago. Animals can get, these can be rapid declines. So I think that although you may not be facing an immediate extinction, if you don't put crossings in, that's probably one link in a chain that could have, maybe years from now, but could have some pretty devastating consequences on a landscape ecosystem scale or a species scale.
Well, let's talk about that project that you've been working on in the Santa Monica Mountains of California called the Liberty Canyon. You brought it up a couple times. Why is this project so special? It was developed, I think the development started in 2018, correct?
Actually, longer than that.
Wow.
Some folks, not me, I started working on this in 2012, but you have partners like the National Park Service, the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, who have been working on this, longer, decades longer in some respects. The Conservancy, actually, we owe a debt of gratitude. We have protected space on both sides of the freeway because of their foresight, right? Wildlife corridors weren't as big a thing in the scientific community then, but they sort of intuited it like, oh, we probably need to connect this green space. So that's exactly where we're citing Liberty Canyon. And then the National Park Service's research, at least on mountain lions, some of the other wildlife started in 2002. And soon after they were starting to see the red flags. So,
and why is the project so special?
Yeah, it's special for a few reasons. One, we are saving a mountain lion population. I can't find precedent for any other crossings that are trying to prevent the extinction of a species, or again, trying to reconnect an entire regional ecosystem to the rest of the world, which the Santa Monica Mountains were cut off from the rest of the world when you put that 101 in, which again, does not do well for resiliency of that ecosystem. So it's also special because it's the largest crossing that we can find that's going to be built because of the size of the freeway. And it's the first of its scale and size to be put in an urban environment. Indeed, some folks early on were like, why are you wasting your time putting a wildlife crossing in LA? Who cares? They're focus on wildlife in more natural areas. So it's special in a lot of ways. It's really groundbreaking and setting a model worldwide for what's possible to intervene and help healthy wildlife populations in such an urbanized environment. Nobody's ever tried this before.
That sounds really exciting. There's also in Texas, there's many projects in Texas, and there's two that I want to speak to. One consists of urban parks outside San Antonio, and another, as you mentioned at the top of the show, is an ocelot crossing east of Austin. Can you talk to these briefly?
Yeah, these are two I haven't visited yet, but I can't wait. I visited a lot around the U.S. I actually had a wildlife crossing field trip planned early on right around when the shutdown happened. But the Robert L.B. Tobin land bridge I love because it's one of those, not every crossing can do this, but this one is connecting for both wildlife and people. Okay, so this is connecting two urban parks. There is a path on the top for people, and then there is paths for wildlife. So it's a great win-win. I think it's the largest in the country right now. Of course, once we break ground, we're going to blow them out of the water, but that's okay. We'll let Texas have it for a little bit.
Little friendly competition between Texas and California. Never hurt anyone.
Exactly. Yeah, we're not going to let Texas outdo us, of course. But I think it's a wonderfully funded project that, again, shows what's possible in a peopled environment. And it's a beautiful structure too. You can look at photos online. And then you look a little south of Austin, a very different type of structure, which is underpasses for ocelots. Again, they were getting hit on roads. And this is where it shows like not every solution needs to be these grand overpasses, right? Again, you look at what the geography is, what the problem is you're trying to solve. And this was just some underpasses that wildlife, that these ocelots could use to get across roads they were having trouble navigating. It reminds me of up here in Yosemite, we had fishers getting killed trying to cross one of the roads, 41 into Yosemite. We didn't need these big overpasses. What worked for them, and again, this is very species specific, was to retrofit culverts with a ramp so that it was above the water. And the fishers started using them to get under the road. So, every sort of solution really gets at what problem and what species you're trying to solve for.
And then Montana, there's a crossing in Montana that is on US Highway 93 that goes through the Flathead Reservation. Why is this one so important?
I think it's important for a number of reasons. So this is what they call the Animals Trail. And these were some of the first crossings in the U.S. as well. And, I think looking at also how to engage and how the tribes do connectivity. My organization's working hand in hand with the tribes on connectivity for bison and bringing bison back. So I think, for me, what's important here is learning from those who know how to do it, which is the Native community. But this one was, again, solving for just issues of roadkill up and down 93. It's a number of crossings. It's not just one. I think they have like 41. They have fish, passages going under the freeway and things like that. So for me, what's great about it is looking at not just one crossing, but looking at an entire region and then looking at how you can intervene, again, from fish to big animals and putting in a whole series to solve the regional issue. We're going to be doing that with Liberty too. Like we're not stopping at Liberty Canyon. It's the biggest problem, but you look at things, highways, if you're not from the area, if you look north, there's the 118, the 126, there's the 5, the 405. I mean, again, this is LA. There's no shortage of freeways we need to get these animals across. So I love the Animals Trail on the Flathead Reservation because they looked at it really broadly and put in a number of solutions.
And for all our listeners out there that are not in California, I do want to point out that we have a way of speaking about our freeways here. We put the word "the" in front of them and then just call them by their number. So there's the 101, the 5, the 210. So just putting that out there for the people who might be like, what are all these numbers?
It is funny. I'm from Boston originally. I came out to California after college. And at first it was like, this freeway worship where they're almost like, deities and why we say the 101.5. But yeah, now I get it.
Well, there's another crossing, I think close to a freeway, not in California. It's in Utah. And I grew up in Utah, actually. It's a famous one. It's called Parleys Canyon Crossing, actually extremely close to my college.
Oh, how fun.
Yeah. And I haven't actually seen it. So when I go back, I want to check this out. And I do say this is a famous crossing because there are videos of animals using this crossing that have been widely shared on social media. This area used to be called Slaughter Alley. Do you want to share something about this particular crossing?
Yeah, I mean, you named it. This was trying to solve a problem, and it was Slaughter Alley. They had animals getting just hit left and right on, I'm not sure you'd call it the 80 in Utah, but on for Route 80. And yeah, they put up a crossing to get these animals across the road. It's a conveyance crossing, and it's extremely successful. I mean, these viral videos, I've actually seen this crossing. I've seen it a few times. I saw it when it was under construction and was able to see it when it was finished. I've driven under it and been there a few times. Again, this shows, different solutions, right? If you look at the Parleys Canyon crossing, their main goal was to get animals from point A to B. So you look at this crossing, it's a bridge with some rock and gravel on top. You know, they didn't put a larger habitat because that wasn't their goal, right? So it works. You contrast it, with like a Liberty Canyon, which again, we're not solving for a Slaughter Alley. We're solving from we need to make this ecosystem whole for plants and small animals and big animals. That's where you get things like habitat on the top, like we're doing. So designed very differently. Our crossing and others very different from what like a Parley is doing, but both successful. And yeah, Parleys has been enormously successful in eliminating their problems, Slaughter Alley.
Now, just switching the conversation a little bit, there's a lot of conservation efforts that focus on the preservation of wildlife, like protecting mountain lions or bringing back wolves. However, if we are not providing safe passage, as we've been speaking to, if we're not providing that safe passage for animals as part of those conservation efforts, are we just shooting ourselves in the foot?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, which I absolutely agree with. My friend Amrock has been working on wolves most of her life, and she had a great quote in the LA Times recently. We had OR 93, this remarkable wolf. Okay, he comes from Oregon. We have wolves in California again. Let's just celebrate that. And that's because of connectivity. That's because we had OR7, a descendant of the Yellowstone wolves, comes into California. We all celebrate first wolf in 90 years. We all followed his antics, and then more wolves came. And you have this pioneering wolf this year, OR93, literally makes it down to Southern California. No scientist predicted that. We almost were going to have a wolf using this new wildlife crossing we're getting built. And he came within 15 miles of my house in Yosemite. We're going to have wolves back in Yosemite really soon. But what happened to him? He ultimately gets killed on the 5. And she had a great quote about it, which is, I wish we provided him with a safer world. And that's true. We can put up all the wildlife crossings in the world, but if we keep building roads and if we keep building development and if we don't take into account how wildlife need to move, it's not going to matter. So, we really do need, the problem is bigger than just wildlife crossings. The problem is, how do we preserve biodiversity in human spaces? And I think that's, the good news is, both federally and in the state of California, you have this 30 by 30 initiative, which is to preserve 30% of, oceans and land as open space by 2030 to ensure that we get a handle on this biodiversity loss. So I think the attention's there, and we are looking at more global solutions than just a crossing here and a crossing there, but it's going to take a lot of work.
You have a new book coming out on Yosemite wildlife. Why is this book important, and what do you find to be unique and awe-inspiring about Yosemite Park and the habitat? And before you answer that, for those that don't know, remind us where Yosemite is located.
Yeah, Yosemite is almost in the exact middle of California in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. It is what I call my North Star. I worked in the park for a decade, and my home is outside Yosemite National Park and has been for 25 years now. And it's I love my two lives, right? I think that preserving, biodiversity in LA is just as important as preserving biodiversity in a Yosemite. And so I love having the two. But we need Yosemites as well. We've just spent a whole episode on why it's important for humans to welcome wildlife back and for us to sort of re-green up infrastructure in cities. But we also need places. Right now, I am unwilling to give up 1 inch of undeveloped space for biodiversity, right? And we need Yosemites where wildlife have primacy, right? Or at least have primacy in most of the park and not everywhere. We still have roads and development, even in our national parks. So, Yosemites Yosemite here are really important places, especially in light of climate change. One chapter in my book is on how places like Yosemite are going to provide refugia in light of climate change and other challenges that wildlife face, because it's like a big buffer against some of the problems, but it's not enough. If you don't have Yosemite connected to other spaces, wildlife don't recognize boundaries, right? They don't recognize a park boundary. But still, the sort of attention and primacy of wildlife in places like a Yosemite is what's really going to be important in the future to ensure that we do have biodiversity, all over the world. But what I love about Yosemite wildlife uniquely, and I've been wanting to write this book for most of my adult life now, since I started visiting Yosemite 30 years ago. Interestingly enough, the last book on Yosemite wildlife, or at least that was focused on it, was in 1924 by Grinnell, who did a famous survey that we now have data. So we know because of climate change, because of his survey with climate and other changes, how wildlife have changed, because we have this great 100-year baseline. But mine's going to be a little different from him. It's not just focused on, the sort of biology, and you'll get all that in the science and species list. It's more focused on what makes Yosemite wildlife unique. And I'll give you one example. Yosemite wildlife, much like Yosemite visitors, will rock climb, right? It is pretty cool to hear and interview some of these rock climbers where they see ringtails, 800 feet up, or snakes. California king snakes are really good rock climbers. I didn't know that. Or Pacific chorus frogs or Mount Lyell salamanders are good rock climbers as well. So for me, it's telling these wondrous stories to help people connect to what makes the park wildlife special is what I'm just so excited to write about. And why now? Because Liberty Canyon's about to break ground and I'm going to have a little more time.
That's great. Well, before we wrap today's show, my last question for you here, and telling the listeners as well, if you want to hear an extended version of the show, we're going to ask 5 or more questions here. Definitely go over to our Patreon account for Eco Justice Radio and listen to the extended version. And so my last question for today, Beth, is where can people get more information on your work and any other resources that you would like to recommend?
Yeah, so you can go to my website is www.bethpratt.com, and information on the work I do, some books I've written, articles I've written, all right there. For the Wildlife Crossing, and it's www.savelAcougars.org. Lots of information on Liberty Canyon, on the mountain lions, P22, and all that. So those are 2 good places. Or social media. I share, for those who follow me on social media, wildlife stories all the time on Facebook, Beth Pratt 1, or Beth Pratt on Twitter, or Yosemite Bethy on Instagram. I just love sharing my explorations in the wild world. And butterfly season is about to begin, and I'm a big butterfly person. So follow me for that. Or of the wildlife I have in my backyard, I have a mountain lion named Shane that hangs out here, bobcats. Anyway, so if you like wildlife, those are some good ways to connect with me.
And I guess one last thing, if from people listening today, and I know that you had mentioned ways that, we can decrease our wildlife disruption. If people are saying, I want to get involved, what would you tell them to do?
Well, that's a good question. There's so many ways to help wildlife. I for me, it's education is the biggest, right? And start looking at the world through an animal's eyes. And that can translate into so many ways. Are you using rat poison? Educate yourself on what that does to wildlife. What products are you using? Palm oil, right? So much of what we do, there are impacts and very destructive impacts to wildlife that we don't think about. And I think that, I could do a checklist here, but I think really educate yourself on the decisions you make and how it impacts wildlife, from your purchases to your behavior. I ask, again, I'm a big mountain biker. Can you, as a mountain biker, maybe not do some trails where the newts or frogs are, doing during mating season or during breeding season, right? It's the little things that actually add up that at least locally, that I think if we just educate yourself about what wildlife is in your area, what you can do to help that wildlife. And then really one big thing, slow down, go below the speed limit. Just give wildlife a break, and that can help an enormous amount.
Well, thank you, Beth. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you being on today's show. And again, everyone, please check out the Patreon if you would like to hear the extended interview of this show. Thank you, Beth.
Thanks for having me, Jessica. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our guest, Beth Pratt with the National Wildlife Federation, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been Room to Roam, the importance of wildlife connectivity and crossings. For an extended version of this interview, become a member of our Patreon. Please connect with us on social media at EcoJustice Radio, SoCal 350, and Adventures in Waste. And if you like what you heard, you know what to do. Subscribe to our podcast, share the episodes, get that information out there, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a donation to the show. You have been listening to Eco Justice Radio on KPFK Los Angeles and KPFT Houston. A project of SoCal 350, the show can be found on kpfk.org, kpft.org, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Created by Mark and JP Morse, executive producer Jack I, producer and co-host Jessica Aldridge, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.